I think I will continue the conversation on the breaking away from the Eurocentric model of studying race and racism by looking at race and racism in China from a relational and transnational perspective. So a little bit about myself. I was born in China and I was educated. I did my PhD in the US. So my dissertation project, the first one, is Diaspora and Class Consciousness. It's about how Chinese migrant workers in Chicago's Chinatown, how they develop knowledge about race and class by interacting with African Americans and Mexican immigrants who live just right next to Chinatown. So through the writing of this book, I try to develop the idea of racial learning. Racial learning is a transnational process for Chinese migrants. So I traced their life back in China. I found that they already have predetermined conceptions of Blackness in China even before they arrive in the US. And that helped me discover my second project. Because while I was researching the quote-unquote the source of their racial learning, I found a group of Chinese language literature on the increasing number of Black African traders in Guangzhou in South China. So that led to my second project, which is African diaspora in South China city, Guangzhou. In this book, I focus on the racism with Chinese characteristics. So I started my racial learning myself, right, as a Chinese in the US. So I was familiar with the US way of understanding race and racism. So this second project on Africans in China really allowed me to compare and contrast how racism works in China. In what way is it different from the American way? In what way is it something, racism with Chinese characteristics? The last one, it's an edited volume. It's not my monograph. My monograph is still in the making. So basically, it's a project I just finished. It's about white-looking foreigners or white-looking Westerners in China who work as English teachers, models, businessmen in China. Because I believe to understand the complexity of race in China, you have to understand both the social construction of Blackness and whiteness and other groups of foreigners. That's my next project. Okay. So 3 important concepts: racial learning, racism with Chinese characteristics, and the transnational circulation of racial knowledge. Some of the challenges, right? There are 2 traps in comparative studies of racism, right? Usually you would say, which is worse? You heard people say, racism in China is worse than in the US. But the which is worse question is actually the wrong question according to Stem and Shahet. Because it ignores the transnational flow of racial knowledge. It ignores the intersection between the global and the local. And the second trap is, I call it identifying the racist, right? You often hear in the US, I'm not a racist, but, right? So such diagnostic view of racism always asks the question, who is the racist? Who are the racists? Once they identify the racist, period, end of discussion, right? So that would end up reifying the Western-centric notion of race and racism, as if everybody know what is race and racism, and fail to recognize the pluralization of racial meaning. There are multiple versions of racism in different parts of the world. So such kind of perspective really closes up the conversation. Instead of opening up new spaces to discuss the dynamic, multivalent, and contested meaning of race and racism in different historical cultural contexts. So what I'm trying to do in my third book, the edited volume, is to shift from the ontological to the epistemological Instead of asking who are the races, so we ask how do people develop knowledge? Because when I research Africans in Guangdong, they keep asking me, where do you Chinese get the idea that black is dirty, right? Black people are stupid or whatever. So it's the epistemological question, how people develop their idea of racial knowledge, how this process constantly changing that really matters. So what I find out is the relational nature of race and racism. There is a process of triangulation between Chineseness, whiteness, blackness, or maybe something else, which will be my next project, right? Basically, the way Chinese look at black people has to channel through the mediation of white supremacy ideology. The way black Africans look at Chinese also has to channel through the Western gaze, right? It's a triangulation. It's not a binary opposition. Also, in the Chinese context, there are two sets of binaries, right? In the US, you only have black, white, but in China, the first binary is Chinese and foreigner. You're either Chinese or you're a foreigner. Because of the intersection of these two sets of binaries, and you have white people, you have an overlap between whiteness and foreignness, because white people remains the default group within the foreigner group. If it's a black foreigner, we don't call black foreigner, we just call black man, black woman, right? So blackness remains a marked identity within the foreigner category. But whenever you mention a foreigner, the generic foreigner, the default foreigner image, is a white-looking person. To understand how black people is racialized in China, we have to understand the intersection of the transnational circulation of racial ideology and the local cultural context. I'm sure many of you read the Bonnet's book, right? How the Europeans became white. Before the Caucasian whiteness became hegemonic, Chinese used to think we are white, right? But Chinese stopped being white when Euro-Americans, right, became the hegemonic white people. Now, if I tell my students I'm white, they would think I'm crazy, right? But within Chinese society, within Asia, there is still this Asian whiteness, right, as beauty standard. It's still very much alive. And on the other hand, in pre-modern China, means before China encountered Western colonial power, skin color indicate class difference rather than racialized difference. Chinese have an aesthetic preference for light skin. What's problematic is this aesthetic preference, light skin, works together with white supremacy. Then it ends up reinforcing anti-black racism. During the early 20th century, the Opium War, right? The Qing reformers, a group of elite intellectuals, they try to resist this white supremacy by coming up with the discourse of the yellow race lineage. Right? When did Chinese become yellow? Right? And they totally turn the meaning of yellow upside down, because within Chinese culture, yellow is the color of the royalty. It's the color of the emperor. Only the emperor, the royal family, can wear the color yellow. Yellow also related to the Yellow River, right? The cradle of Chinese civilization, right? It's very much like Black Power, right? So this yellow race lineage, because it's not based on the Western idea of race, but it's also based on fictive kinship, the descendants of the Yellow Emperor. We are all the descendants of the Yellow Emperor, right? So it's a creative mixture of indigenous ideas and Western notion of race in order to resist white supremacy. However, this kind of racial nationalism is also compromised because it fails to resist anti-black racism. In Emma Tan's, she's a historian, in her work, she studies how even in the early 20th century, the Chinese reformers already idolize Euro-Asian children, right? The children from Chinese and white families. So they construct Chinese as non-white, but like white. or compatible with whiteness, yet different from blackness. Anti-black racism, there are many different reasons. The first reason is the convergence of the white gaze and the traditional Chinese aesthetic preference for light skin. If these two come together, really reinforce anti-black racism. So it partly reproduced the anti-black racism in the US, such as dehumanization, hypersexuality, criminalization, illegality, etc., etc. But it's also complicated by the Sino-African friendship discourse, right? In Mao's era, you have the Third World Alliance, right? China always treats Africa as a political partner. Our African brothers, even ordinary Chinese, they are aware of such kind of political discourse. In my own research on interactions between rural to urban migrants in Guangzhou and African migrants. So in Guangzhou, in the African market in Guangzhou, I noticed an intersection between international migration, which is African migrants, and internal migration, which are who are rural to urban migrants, right? They gather in the market and they do business with each other. The rural migrants also do all kinds of service work for the African traders. So I call it grassroots interaction. So in this grassroots interaction, there's the potential of producing more nuanced racial knowledge about blacks, because they start to distinguish Nigerians, Ghanaians, right, Muslims, Muslim blacks, or Christian blacks, right? Of course, they fight with each other. There's lots of mutual racialization, but there's also the development of more nuanced racial knowledge. So I made a further distinction between interactive racialization and presumptive racialization. Interactive racialization is like you rub shoulders with each other, you interact with each other on a daily basis. It's based on lived experience. Presumptive racialization mainly is by white-collar, middle-class Chinese who sit in their air-conditioned office just browsing the website, right? Second-hand knowledge filled with racialized stereotypes. Okay. After my African project, I studied the white-looking people in China. So I understand the whiteness as an invisible power system. I try to make a distinction between whiteness as a global power structure and white people as white bodies, right? Because the two doesn't always match. In the Chinese racial classification system, foreignness often trumps whiteness. So instead of identifying themselves as white, they would say, I'm a foreigner, right? However, this foreigner discourse actually obscure the racialized identity of being white. So I argue that whiteness cloaked in foreignness actually undermine anti-racist initiative by hiding the transnational circulation of white supremacist ideologies and practices. Also, there's this ambiguity associated with whiteness. Who is white, right? For Chinese people, anyone who does not look like Chinese, you have big eyes, big nose, can be white. So my finding is the categories of racial white actually become broadened in China. So multiracial people, light-skinned people from Latin America are also included in the white category. So who is white in China is not very clear, but the boundary between black and non-black seems to be quite clear. Who is black? Chinese people never doubt that. I don't have time. Do I have? Let me see. Huh? Okay, this is the last one. What's the role of the Chinese state? That's another challenge, because the Chinese state actually denied there's racism in China. So I think racism is just something from the West, from the US, from Europe. Chinese, because we suffered colonialism, right? It's not possible for Chinese to be racist. So this race mute culture actually contributes to the perpetuation of stereotypes, racializations. It's counterproductive. And also there is this absence of anti-racist education in universities, in schools, and look at the blackface performance in China. Chinese people do not find it problematic because they were not educated about the history of blackface performance in the West. So that's another problem we have to deal with. Thank you.